Prosecutors say accused killer Did Kohberger disguised himself in a mask showing only his eyes. As Jim Array reports, that could end up being the smoking gun in the case.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Have a look at this new image of Did Kohberger, a selfie that he took on the day of the incident. Look into those eyes, look at that face, look at the gesture that he's making with a thumbs up. What is going on here?
This morning, a new image of Did Kohberger, allegedly taken just hours after prosecutors say he murdered 4 University of Idaho students back in 2022. The selfie, part of a trove of new documents revealing how lawyers on both sides may be planning to argue their cases at his murder trial in August.
August is still 4 or 5 months away, but some questions certainly have come up, have sort of boiled up through the ether. One of them is, when does premeditation start? What feeds it? At what moment was the seed for this horrendous crime planted in the perpetrator's mind? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now, I've often thought about those questions while writing about other cases such as Casey Anthony, Chris Watts, and Scott Peterson. I do think it's thousands of times worse when it's a parent or spouse who is living with you, and meanwhile they are quietly calculating when to murder you. It's the ultimate betrayal. And with Chris Watts and Scott Peterson, their wives were pregnant. It's supposed to be a time of new life and new opportunity and new hope for a family. Meanwhile, someone has got murderous thoughts, someone who's in your bed with you, someone who you're cooking food for. And so Kohberger, the prime suspect in this case, he was in a position as a sort of university tutor in criminology, which makes his position as predator so incongruous. But then, think of Rex Heuermann and Richard Allen. Suspects come in all shapes and sizes, don't they? Now, what do you think Kohberger is trying to communicate in this selfie taken at 10:30 a.m. on November 13, 2022, after the murders? This was taken something like 6 hours after the murders. I think even before 911 was called. 2 hours before 911 was called. Now, this could be sadistic duping delight. The sort of thing mass shooters often do as part of the aftermath to their horrible acts, serving as a kind of self-serving manifesto. These individuals are typically incels, losers, invisible people with no social kind of currency, who are desperate to matter and desperate to show agency when, in a social sense, they really have none whatsoever. And I think this is a big reason for this crime. You never hear it spoken about, that the kids in that house, the murder victims, had massive social currency. Everybody loved them. They had a lot of friends. They had parties. They were, social animals in a sense, whereas Kohberger was this lone wolf knocking on the door, howling outside, but somehow not being gained entry. And I do think this moment of spiteful celebration could be the nail in Kohberger's coffin, because have a look at this picture again. What is a clue in that picture? Well, it provides a vital clue on the day of the incident, corroborated by a witness, and it's something that's going to resonate, how could it not, with the jury. Any idea what I'm driving at?
Prosecutors say Kohberger bought a mask like this one, known as a Balaclava, from a Dick's Sporting Goods in Pittsburgh 10 months before the murders. And look, when you put it on, it covers the entire face, except for the eyes and the eyebrows.
Now, referring to the affidavit, I just remember bushy eyebrows. That's all I could think about. That is what the roommate Dylan Mortensen later told investigators, according to court documents. Mortensen had described how she opened her door sometime before 4:19 a.m. on November 13, 2022. She said that she saw a figure walking past her in black clothing and a ski mask. That's how she described this balaclava. And she said it covered the intruder's forehead and mouth.
Eyewitness Dylan Mortensen says she saw a man in a similar mask in the house the night of the murders.
She sees the killer passing by, a man dressed in black, a black mask up to his nose with bushy eyebrows, as she describes him, about 5'10", athletic.
Well, it's interesting that Blum has emerged as the sort of default expert on this case. Hasn't he written a book about it? I'm not actually sure whether she described him as athletic, as skinny, that he was tall and skinny, but I could be wrong. Now, it also wasn't a ski mask, but crucially, as we've seen here, it didn't cover enough of the intruder's face, nor could it hide the fact, as I say as well, that he was tall and skinny. Prosecutors say that records show Kohberger purchased a black, this is the important part, not just the purchase of it, but when, a black balaclava on January 10, 2022, at a Dick's Sporting Goods in Pittsburgh. I think the other thing that's interesting is it's black. You know, he is purchasing it not to go out skiing. And this was 11 months before the stabbing deaths of Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan on November 13. It is, frankly, terrifying to think that Kohberger likely harbored murderous intent for 11 months, or even longer. I mean, he didn't just buy the mask. Something had to have been in place in his psychology, which reached a tipping point in January 2023, that led to him buying the mask. And yet his intent was somehow kept in check for almost a year before he gave into it. Now, one thing that I think is interesting is when he buys the mask is just after Christmas and New Year. When does he commit this crime? Just before Christmas. And gives one a sense that he was dreading that period, that time of the year, in a sense. By then, it was likely a murderous fantasy, a temptation like an itch that he couldn't resist scratching, or a ring of power that he was carrying but not allowed to use. And obviously, between January and November, probably there were a series of incidents that sort of was taking him sort of where he wanted to go. Now, in my opinion, the premeditation ought not to be a surprise. It's the length of time that is interesting. The other interesting thing is, for some reason, I must say, I understood the mask Kohberger wore was a COVID mask, and it wasn't black. I thought it was one of those sky blue, those light blue masks. In fact, I remember one creator even did an animation of a black-clad perpetrator wearing a blue COVID mask. And that misrepresentation is as a result of the poorly worded affidavit. If you're going to say, oh, hang on, I do see it says taller, male, athletically built with bushy eyebrows. I'm not sure I would describe Kohberger as athletic. But the point is, if you say a figure clad in black clothing and a mask, it doesn't necessarily mean the mask is black. Do you see that? And it doesn't describe the mask in a lot of detail. Certainly, the ski mask is not accurate. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of additional inculpatory evidence is coming to light as well, including apparently Kohberger's purchase of the K-bar knife, the murder weapon that has never been found. And he did that on Amazon.
According to prosecutors, Kohberger bought a K-bar knife and sheath just months before they say he killed Maddie Mogan, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, and Kaylee Gonzalez in their off-campus home. According to police, a K-bar knife sheath was found next to one of the victims with
DNA that was, they say, a statistical match to Kohberger. Now, again, the interesting thing here is when this purchase apparently occurred, right? The K-bar knife and the sheath was bought 8 months prior to the murder. So one can see the crime is starting to crystallize in the criminal's mind. First, he's worried about what he's going to wear, and then he's thinking about what he's going to use. It's first the mask, then the knife. Let's go to foxatlanta.com. But in a filing released on Wednesday, prosecutors say Kohberger bought a K-bar knife 8 months before the killings. The evidence turned up in a search warrant which directed law enforcement to seize from Amazon.com Brian Kohberger's customer click activity pertaining to knives and accessories. The warrant covered his Amazon history from March 20, 2022 through March 30, 2022. The mention of the limited search for knife purchases came out as the prosecution pushed back at Kohberger's contention that his Amazon records were taken out of context and are not relevant. Now, I must say, this is one aspect that is very, it's like a hole in the Ramsey case, is that we don't have access to the credit card records, or certainly they weren't provided very early, and also to some extent the call records. That could have made the investigation into that case a lot easier. Then, in a scenario that reminds us of Rex Heuermann's alleged blueprint for murder, prosecutors want to use Brian's own writings against him as well. This is from ABC7. Prosecutors want to use one of Brian Kohberger's academic papers against him at his trial for the Idaho College murders this summer. The accused killer wrote the paper while he was a grad student studying criminal justice at DeSalle University in 2020. In other words, 2 years prior to the incident. According to new court documents filed this week, the 12-page paper details a case involving a woman who was stabbed to death at a trailer park. It is not immediately clear whether the case is hypothetical or real. Well, I hope that is going to be ascertained at trial. Interestingly, Amanda Knox, you know, the woman doing a sort of victory tour with another book about how great her life is right now, she also wrote a fictional scenario that evoked aspects of the murder of Meredith Kercher. And there's some details about that scenario in this excerpt. In his paper, Kohberger lists the steps for a crime scene investigator entering the scene. The steps included packaging evidence for forensic analysis, determining suspects, motives, and writing closing reports. In their documents, prosecutors point to aspects of the case that are similar to the University of Idaho murders, such as the use of the knife, surveillance video, and collection of DNA. And we know that Kohberger was seen in some store wearing, I think, sort of nitrile gloves, and you got the idea that he was trying to sequester his own DNA when out in public. He was also found, when they arrested him, that he seemed to be bagging Christmas wrapping and, you know, all the paraphernalia around Christmas in order to do exactly the same thing, and that he'd been seen cleaning his vehicle. Now, I guess what Kohberger forgot to list in his to-do list was, don't forget your knife sheath at the scene and try to stay cool in a house with 6 people inside as you murder one at a time. I must say, I'm surprised bad Teachergate hasn't come up in what feels essentially like a trial before the trial. I'm not going to take it further than that, but I do want to quickly mention why I haven't really been covering the case despite all the news. You guys do know I visited 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, and I've actually made a deliberate decision to mostly not cover this case until the trial. Why? Well, it's in order to do my bit to protect the survivors and, by extension, the other students, you know, who faced false accusations and worse, but also the students just want to get on with their studies, and this trauma really makes that hard to do. You know, this analysis on this channel is a rare exception, and I don't actually think I'll be coming back to this case again anytime soon. Now, it seems, despite the efforts of some like me and this channel, D&B have been targeted regardless, and some creators and elements in the mainstream media have covered this case as if they are entitled to, despite the fact that it ends up being a lightning rod for negative chatter and pressure for 2 young women who will need to be witnesses in court at some point. Does the media care more about getting a bite at the cherry or protecting the integrity of cases like these? Does the media covering this case care more about justice or themselves? Do they do more harm than good? What do you guys think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.